Today's episode of the Podcast Master side of a special 5-part series I've recorded, catching up on lost episodes of Interpreting Wine. No doubt, as you may have noticed, on occasion some time will pass between the recording of an episode and it being published. These 5 episodes were all recorded back in 2018 and never found a space on the podcast that year in among the 220 episodes and numerous series that I recorded then. So what better way to draw light to the fantastic guests and give them their own series now? We kick things off today with Ivo Varbanov in an episode that I recorded shortly before the European Confederation of Independent Winegrowers tasting last year. This is the first time that I've covered Bulgarian wine on the podcast. In his episode, Ivo gives us a history of the fair, before giving us a primer on Bulgarian wine, and telling us about some of the Bulgarian producers who were on show at the fair. Enjoy.
Since 2015, the Bulgarian Association of Independent Winegrowers was organizing a tasting in London, a trade tasting, which was generally in the Bulgarian embassy. We had something like 15, 16, 17 producers, and it was a quite successful event. But we thought that things could be even better. And having a position as a vice president of the European Confederation of Independent Winegrowers, which has something like 12,000 wine producers across Europe in different countries, I proposed last year, when we had the annual general meeting in Brussels, I proposed to extend the invitation to all other countries, members of CEVI, and try to do something a little bit bigger, for several reasons. One, because we thought that we had a certain limitation just as a national association to present our work, simply because, of course, Bulgaria has a very interesting reputation, let's put it this way, in terms of winemaking, because it used to be in the 80s a large producer in terms of volume, but not of exactly premium and ultra premium quality. Since the late 90s, things did change in terms of production, ownership of vineyards, etc. So there was a very quick and positive development of the industry. But the message was slightly different. We wanted to communicate, because we are small, independent wine growers, which means that we do everything from A to Z, from the vineyard to the winemaking to the selling of the wine, and therefore extending it to the European family, this tasting, it would have had, of course, a positive image for us as well, but it is something that has not been done so far in the past. So it was, I think, an idea which everyone liked at our meeting in Brussels, and we started working on the project. Unfortunately, a couple of countries could not attend, simply because they already had their schedule completely full of events. The Portuguese actually had a tasting in London just I think a few weeks ago, and so therefore they welcome very much the idea, but decided that for this year they won't manage to participate. So in fact we are slightly reduced in terms of numbers, but I think it's a very good start for a first event of such nature. We have 66 producers, if I'm not mistaken, and that is, I think, a very positive start. Talking a little bit about CEVI, the European Confederation of Independent Winegrowers, or like the French is the Confédération Européenne des Vignerons Indépendants, has been around for 15 years, based in Paris, has basically the main function is to protect the interests of small producers, especially on a European level and on a national level in the various countries. So it's a form of syndicate, but since probably 2 years we've been discussing quite a lot about the possibility to show as well what is really an independent wine grower, because often when we had talks in Brussels talking about agricultural policies and different issues, we've noticed that the people on the other side of the barricade were not very understanding what it means. So this was the other reason why we decided to start showing what we really do. Also because the times are mature. On a national level, the French vignerons, the National Association of France, the Italians and the Portuguese, all of these associations do tastings as such. So it would make perfectly sense to organize something which is common, because we share the same working ethics, the same philosophy of winemaking, and very similar as well agricultural practices. In most cases they are organic and biodynamic producers, or less interventionalist, and definitely not industrial practices of winemaking. So it is a very specific product, and it's part of the overall European cultural heritage, that product. All the national association functions in a very similar way. It's by invitation and not by application, which means that we invite members they need to cover specific criteria. They are not criteria of quality only, but they are of each association has some specific rules, but in general you need to own your own vineyard, so you don't buy more than 50% of the grapes that you use to make wine. So it's not a négociant, it's a wine grower. Then you make your own wine. This can be either in your own premises or somewhere else, and also you participate in the of course in the bottling and selling of the product. So it's A to Z basically criteria. Quality of course is important, but of course there are some producers who are small or who are improving their work. Things are not so linear. There are things that of course can be improved, but also something which is very important for instance for the Bulgarian association is that we invite people who can work in a team, people who are able to put on the side their ego and work together as a team to try to develop the whole winemaking, basically philosophy and working ethics in the country.
So I'm yet to really talk about or really cover Bulgarian wine on the podcast, and sitting next to you here, it would be great to just have your overview on kind of where you guys are and how far I guess you've developed from that previous situation where it was very much about bulk and perhaps the quality suffered as a result.
Yes. So a little bit of background about the previous 40 years. So after World War II, of course, having a communist system in place, everything was nationalized. Therefore, the government decided to create a serious business specifically for bulk wine and for wine produced at a very low price point. Despite the country having the potential to make even very fine wines. In that direction, the government did a really good job, in a sense that created very efficient large wineries, very efficient cooperatives growing grapes, and managed to create a very competitive product, at least in that price bracket. Of course, the development in the research was also there at the time, so they knew exactly what they were doing. They were doing what was required from that price point, and in fact, it was very successful. Like in the UK in the late 70s and early 80s, Bulgarian wine was selling very well at very good prices, and people were very happy. Lots of older generation people have really fond memories of those kind of wines. What happened in 1989 is that the system changed, the political system, and therefore little by little there was a completely change of the ownership of some large wineries into private corporations, and by the late 90s some producers came on the market, small producers, in some cases wine lovers who had a bit of money and decided that they wanted to make wine, which is fairly common, I would say, and also some winemakers who managed through some European funding programs and some other projects to create small vineyards and wineries. At the moment there are 350 wine producers in the country, which is a considerable number because we are talking only about less than 20 years of modern winemaking. Historically, Bulgaria has tradition in winemaking, despite being under the Ottoman Empire for over 5 centuries. The tradition was not lost. We have a different approach, like compared, for instance, to Greeks, which are our southern neighbors, because we don't have so many indigenous varietals. Perhaps some of them were lost in all these transitions, but we do work well with, I would say, a mix of international and indigenous varietals. In fact, probably in the future some of the indigenous will develop further in terms of quality specifically, but at the moment it's very difficult to work only with indigenous, simply because the lack of serious funding for the research is something that is impossible to tackle as a small producer, simply because that is something that is done generally by universities or research centers, and that is something that a vigneron or winemaker cannot afford to do, and it also takes probably a good 10 years to do a research project on a varietal. I think one of the important things that it's the strength is the terroir. We have, being a small country, we do have lots of different terroirs. Half of the country has a more continental climate and the rest is more Mediterranean. It's possible to make both white and red wines, and some international varieties like Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot work very well in that kind of terroir. But even there are some surprises nowadays. Some people have planted Tempranillo, others have planted Sangiovese. We have Viognier, Petit Manseng, and also some unusual grapes like Rakatsiteli, which in fact has been there for a long time because it was planted during communist time. So a Georgian varietal has been there for more than 50 years. Our local varietals are Mavrud, Melnik, Rubin, which is a very promising crossing between Nebbiolo and Syrah, then Gumza, which is the Hungarian Kadarka, and then some white varietals like Dimyat and Tamyanka. These are more or less the local varietals which we work with as well.
So there are 15 Bulgarian wineries going to be coming over for the tasting. I want to do one thing now. Is just actually focus in on, can be one or maybe two of the wineries that are coming over, and I guess for you to tell us their story in a bit more depth and give us a sort of a different angle of that story of people now moving towards a more quality-driven approach to winemaking.
Yes, there are several interesting things coming to this, interesting wines coming to this tasting, so it's very difficult to pick things that I think are representative. In fact, I would say there are at least 4 or 5 wines which are really strong in terms of quality and also the originality of their work. I could probably mention at least 3 which are very interesting in my opinion. One is in the northwest of the country, Borovica, which in fact is one of the very first one. 2 winemakers started that project, a man and a lady. Unfortunately, 2 years ago the gentleman who started it passed away, but the work is being carried on by his partner, and they are focused on single vineyard wines. So in fact they do make maybe 40 different wines, and each one is from a specific parcel. So sometimes there are wines which are in the region of 500 or 600 bottles only parcel. So in fact this is very interesting in terms of philosophy of winemaking. It's a very natural approach. It's somehow untouched the wine and express very much the vineyard. So I believe this is a very interesting project in terms of the quality and the originality of their work. I think another interesting producer is definitely in the Sliven region, Rossidi, who works mainly with international varietals, so Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Gewürztraminer. So being in the sub-Balkan area and having a slightly cooler climate compared to the rest of the southern part of the country, he's producing very elegant and fine wines, focusing on international varietal. He makes as well a Rubin. As I said earlier, it's a crossing of Nebbiolo and Syrah, but that is from purchased grapes. So in fact he's about to plant some of that, a small vineyard of that varietal. Of course, I can say a few words about myself, which I think also it's a project which is quite interesting, because simply I had a completely different approach in the vineyard compared to everyone else in the area. I did a lot of things that were never done before, having a very respectful towards nature approach. Therefore, the preparation of the land for the vineyard and the treatment of the land afterwards has been using principles of biodynamics and organic farming, and I'm very proud to say that we never used any herbicides, pesticides, or any other things that are actually killing the soil. So in fact, my probably most well-known wine, the Syrah, which I make, some people say it's probably the best Syrah produced in the country, and I think it's simply because I'm not a winemaker, I'm a musician, but simply I have really good fruits to work with. So this is a perfect example of an expression of terroir. I do believe that this tasting specifically, it's a very good start as well for the UK market to understand clearly and better the difference between independent wine growers and more industrial-oriented producers. Of course, lots of independent retailers and, of course, sommeliers in the top restaurants, specifically in London, do know that difference, and they are aware. But for less known parts of the world, and like also Bulgaria, I have encountered, as an example, an importer who was claiming that he's importing only artisan producers, and because he was not really aware that in fact the Bulgarian producer he was actually distributing, it's a producer who makes 1.5 million bottles. So in fact I think it's very important to understand this, because price wise those kind of wines are very competitive, and it would be very beneficial as well for the UK market in this precise moment where things are a little bit difficult, taking into account the drop of the pound and the prices which are obviously going up, and the cost of running businesses like restaurants, shops, rents, etc. are very high. So it's a really good opportunity for importers to know better these kind of products, which I think will only help them improve their business.
Thank you so much, Ivo. Although quite a bit of time has passed since our interview, I still think there's loads here that the listener can learn from. And I'd be excited to feature any other Bulgarian producers or wines on the podcast in the future. I've left below details of Ivo Varbanov Wines themselves, as well as the website of the European Confederation of Independent Winegrowers and the Bulgarian Association of Independent Winegrowers, so do check those out. And of course, I'd love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. We've got a real treat next time in this special Lost episode series. As you may have heard, last year I did extensive coverage with Dynamic Vines of their portfolio tasting back in October. However, long before that, back in May 2018, Frederick Grepp was kind enough to invite me along to record a tasting with Frank Pascal in London, which will be next time on this special Lost episode series. See you then.